Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Are you awake? Yeah, good. Okay. Take a selfie so you remember this moment, and turn off your cell phones, please. Thank you. Okay, I hope you all have a copy of this book, this lovely book, which you've been spending hours reading. I've written my lecture in such a way to try to help you understand this very big book, of which you only read a small fraction. So this is kind of how my lecture is oriented. Okay, let's get started. It's a few minutes after 1. As you know, this week, and I believe next week also, you'll be reading The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides and discussing it in your classes. Thucydides' history is important for understanding the ancient Greek world, and perhaps more importantly, for the purposes of CVSP, it provides insight into how we understand the world we live in, the human condition and the standards that we hold as ideals. So it has a lot to say about our own existence in our world at the level of the individual and at the level of politics. Now, more or less all the readings in the course do this. But with Thucydides, we start to see how the ancient Greeks started to look at the world in a slightly different way, okay? So you can kind of think about what Thucydides is saying and how it compares to what Homer says, for example, in the Odyssey. So who was Thucydides? First of all, he was an Athenian who lived in the 5th century BC. His History of the Peloponnesian War recounts a war between Athens and Sparta that occurred during his lifetime. So people who want to really know what happened, who won, who lost, who the victims were, who the victors were, or people who want to be entertained by history can get what they want from the book. But we need to make clear that many historians examine the past to uncover something of a deeper reality, the forces and circumstances that shape particular events. So the question is, what is Thucydides telling us in this history, aside from simply recounting events? He states very boldly, "My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." This is really an incredible claim, yeah? How can an account of a war that happened 2,500 years ago possibly have any relevance for today, much less forever? Most of what we know about Thucydides comes from his book. And it's not much, actually. He refers to himself in the very first line. Thucydides the Athenian, so he's referring to himself in the third person. Thucydides the Athenian wrote the history of the war between Athens and Sparta. He lived in Athens in the 5th century BC, but he was not an ordinary Athenian. He was wealthy. His family owned gold mines in northern Greece. He tells us that during the war he served as a general in the Athenian army. He was only 35 years old at the time. He also mentions that when he was a general, he was ordered to defend the city of Amphipolis in Thrace in northern Greece. The city was valuable for its strategic location and for its wealth. Okay, I just referred to gold mines in that area. But Thucydides' military expedition failed to arrive in time to defend the city against the Spartans, the enemies of the Athenians. Consequently, the Athenian assembly punished him, and so he was dismissed from his command, and he was sentenced to exile from Athens until the end of the war. This, by the way, is you'll be hearing more about exile from the polis, from the city-state, in your readings to come. And in fact, exile from homeland, as you've already read in the Odyssey. He took the opportunity of his forced retirement to research and write his History of the Peloponnesian War. He traveled extensively to interview participants in the conflict and to visit the various theaters of the war in Greece and perhaps as far away as Syracuse on the island of Sicily, where the outcome of the war was actually decided. He died in the year 400 okay, BC, before he could finish writing book 8 of his work, in the middle of his narrative of the year 411, with 6.5 years of the history left to recount. So, in order to understand Thucydides' book, it's helpful, I think, to consider his intellectual background. Not much is known, as I said. In his history, so in his own book, he says he admires a man named Antiphon, who was a sophist and a politician. Other sources suggest that he studied with Protagoras, who was also a sophist. Sophism, very briefly, and you'll probably be talking about this in your class and in classes to come in the semester. Sophism, very briefly, was a prominent intellectual movement in 5th century Greece, known for the use of rhetoric in argumentation. So one of its proponents claimed, for example, that he could make the weaker argument the stronger, simply by arguing effectively. Okay? Thucydides, however, seems not to have been interested in the usual benefits of sophism, which Plato later associated with the political ambitions of well-to-do young men in Athens. However, some see the influence of sophism in Thucydides' rhetorical techniques. For example, in his presentation of antithetical elements, that is, elements that oppose each other, the cities of Athens and Sparta, for example, or the politicians, Pericles and Cleon. So the question is, why does Thucydides do this? What do these cities and men represent that he's opposing them in this way? That's something to think about. He also reports two sides of political disputes, for example, in a section of the reading assignment called The Debate at Sparta, which is a series of speeches given at the outset of the war. In these speeches, you as the reader can examine directly the conflicting arguments and points of view. Perhaps Thucydides is telling us that this is how we should try to understand the world. That is, you need to understand different points of view. Thucydides used this technique in his narrative style also. There's a section of the text called the funeral oration of Pericles, which is in your assignment. Pericles was a great Athenian statesman and an advocate of democracy who in the text gives a very eloquent speech about the virtues of Athens. And so in the speech, he talks about all these noble ideals. These ideals stand in the absence of ideals in the next episode in the text, which is about the plague epidemic that struck Athens. In the funeral oration, Pericles declaims to the Athenians, "What I would prefer is that you should fix your eyes every day on the greatness of Athens as she really is, and should fall in love with her. When you realize her greatness, then reflect that what made her great was men who were ashamed to fall below a certain standard." Okay? So men of virtue, huh? The standard of Athens is based on the lawfulness of Athens and the lawfulness of Athenians. So Pericles continues, "We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are the protection of the oppressed and those unwritten laws." Think about what that means. Those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break. He seems to be telling us here that our behavior in society should be guided by laws, okay? Laws that we respect. But written laws aren't enough. There are also unwritten laws. What are these unwritten laws? Maybe the expectations of personal virtues and moral behavior that we need to follow also. Then Thucydides moves on to talking about the plague epidemic that devastated Athens. Okay? So again, oppositions. First, the nobility, the following of laws in the funeral oration, and then the plague epidemic. Those unwritten laws that he talks about all of a sudden seem very, very fragile. Okay? Almost, some people might say an illusion, but I wouldn't go that far personally. In Thucydides' eyewitness account of the plague, he says, "In other respects also, Athens owed to the plague in the beginnings of a state of unprecedented lawlessness. As for what is called honor, no one showed himself willing to abide by its laws. So doubtful was it whether we would survive to enjoy the name of it. It was generally agreed that what was both honorable and valuable was the pleasure of the moment and everything that might conceivably contribute to that pleasure. No fear of God or law of man had a restraining influence. So, he's contrasting Athenian law and virtue in the funeral oration with the appearance of lawlessness with the plague. Why? Was he attacking Pericles and Athenian virtue? Was he being cynical? Think about this. Thucydides' understanding of both Pericles and the plague demonstrates his ability to see the deeper realities of the history that he was interested in. For example, the tensions underlying civic virtue and the fragility of human character. Whatever his background, Thucydides had a remarkable ability to observe the connections between the individual and the world, okay? The individual and the world that the Greeks lived in. And perhaps even we can extrapolate and think about us as individuals in the world we live in. To sum up, the author of the history of the Peloponnesian War was an Athenian. He served as a general in the Athenian army. He was removed from command for failure in that war and punished. He wrote a history of the war that he fought in. In other words, you would expect him to write a grossly biased history, yeah? One that favors one side over the other. And again, something else that you might talk about. You know, does he present any biases in this account? Moreover, he claims that the history will be of relevance for all time. So if his method of history might be matched, his confidence would certainly be hard to beat. So, is Thucydides' confidence an act born of hubris? Another important question to grapple with. For Thucydides, history meant a systematic inquiry into contemporary events. Don't think of history simply as being the past. Think of history as a synonym for inquiry. You can think of it as the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War. He had little patience for the interest his predecessors like Herodotus showed in the romantic element of the stories they recorded. His criticism of this other famous Greek writer, Herodotus, is always indirect, but it is certainly clear that he considered the historical method used by them, by Herodotus and others, to be entirely inadequate. Thucydides remarks, the rest of the Hellenes, too, make many incorrect assumptions, not only about the dimly remembered past, but also about contemporary history. Most people, in fact, will not take trouble in finding out the truth, but are much more inclined to accept the first story they hear. This is something, of course, that we can apply to our own lives. Think about the things we hear that we are inclined to accept as true. Based on what? A friend told me, it must be true. Based on familiarity. What do these things have to do with accuracy? Okay? Thucydides concerned himself only with contemporary events, and his approach to doing history rested on the conviction that little can be known of the distant past, interestingly enough, even though he said that his account would be remembered for all time. I would argue then that his historical method, his principles, and his ability to distinguish what is significant from what's not proves for us today that much can be learned from any past, okay, no matter how distant. So, what about his historical method? And here you can start to compare him with the authors that you've read so far this semester. First of all, he avoided discussion of myths and gods, okay? Immediately, there's a kind of difference from Homer. The supernatural in any form had no place in his analysis of human affairs. Politics and society were subjects to be examined with skepticism. He states that all evidence should be tested for accuracy. On your fly sheet, there's a quote, which I'll read to you. And with regard to my factual reporting of the events of the war, I have made it a principle not to write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own general impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I have described, or else I heard of them from eyewitnesses whose reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible. He says that the accuracy of his evidence was further enhanced by his development of a chronological sequence, or scheme, in which to incorporate his data. There was no standard calendar in ancient Greece, okay? So he had to devise this system of recording the years by summer and winter seasons. So his array of verified information could be placed within the proper context, in the context of that chronological scheme. And this would then, in turn, allow for an effective interpretation of that evidence. So then he can start to distinguish primary causes from secondary causes. Certain political and military events might take on a kind of superficial quality, even though they're very dramatic, right? They might then simply appear to be symptoms of a deeper problem. He's always trying to kind of penetrate, to get into a kind of deeper sense of what's happening, okay? A lot is made of his method, but remember that his method was also tempered by his particular view. So when he uses the phrase, for example, reasonable accuracy and truest causes, we're reminded that we're reading his interpretation of the war, just as we read his interpretation of the speeches that he reports to us in such detail. Obviously, people weren't recording these, okay? And he says very candidly about this, I have found it difficult, this again is on your fly sheet, I have found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speeches say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation. What about that for a technique, okay? The historian Herodotus recreated the atmosphere of the past. Herodotus is the historian that Thucydides criticized. For Thucydides, recreating the past, however, was not enough. Thucydides' historical method forms a narrative that actually contains, and this is how I like to explain it, it contains a series of arguments, or a series of interpretations, in effect, founded on the belief that our knowledge of the past is useful because we can understand it from all sides. We can see the difference between the profound and the superficial. His intellectual acuity may have been sharpened by sophistic training, okay, to go back to sophism as a kind of intellectual technique. But by our reading between the lines, we get the sense that his historical method was guided by moral convictions, okay? Moral convictions are not usually associated with the sophists. And these moral convictions for Thucydides ran as deep as those realities he was trying to bring to the surface. By means of understanding history, Thucydides believed we could make better political judgments. Political judgments. And aren't political judgments really moral judgments? And at least, or shouldn't they be moral judgments? And at least understand, if not entirely avoid, such tragedies as the war between Athens and Sparta. So, let's think about these arguments. It's a way to kind of understand the book without me summarizing all the events that take place. That would be absurd. So think about it in terms of arguments. When we see the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War as an account of the past that includes interpretations and convictions, it becomes clear that we have a series of arguments that we need to kind of distinguish. One might consider it, for example, a treatise on historiography. Historiography is the method of doing history. It's the way you do it, okay? After all, he argues that his evidence is more reliable than, as he says, that of the poets. When he's referring to the poets, who's he referring to? Homer, exactly, okay? So it's more reliable than that of Homer, who exaggerates the importance of his themes, or of the prose chroniclers like Herodotus, okay, who you haven't read, who are less interesting in telling the truth than in catching the attention of their public, and whose authorities cannot be checked. This method forms the foundation for additional arguments, okay? So maybe we're kind of starting at the deepest level and moving up. In the past, the Persian War had been considered the greatest war, okay, especially by Herodotus. But Thucydides argued that the war between Athens and Sparta was the greatest war of all time. As he expresses it, more worth writing about than any of those which had taken place in the past. And he gives reasons for this claim. It lasted such a long time, it lasted for 27 years, longer than the war with Persia. He says, never before had so many cities been captured and then devastated, whether by foreign armies or by the Hellenic powers themselves. Never had there been so many exiles, never such loss of life, both in the actual warfare and in internal revolutions. This destruction that was produced by humans was followed by upheaval in the natural world, wide areas he's not saying that one affects the other, but it just was a terribly, difficult time. Wide areas, for instance, were affected by violent earthquakes, eclipses, drought, famine, plague. All these calamities fell together upon the Hellenes. So after the outbreak of the Great War. So historiographical, historical. Then what? It'd be political or something like that. He argues, for example, that the power and greatness of Athens was the result of its development of navigation and commerce. Okay, so Athens is starting to kind of extend its power outward, and this is creating problems. The Athenian navy enabled the city to accumulate wealth, and this was the foundation of its empire. On the more immediate causes of the war, Thucydides reports, and immediate means we're getting closer to the top, okay, to the surface. Thucydides reported the complaints of the two sides against each other and the clash of their respective interests. But those superficial causes obscured the real reason for the war: imperial ambition. Thucydides argues that what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. His historical argument has even a wider reach, however, okay, which actually may take us back down again in our kind of scheme, in part because of his method. But also more significantly, as with thinkers of his era, the broad scope of his vision rested on the conviction that moral issues and conflicts were an integral element in politics. Okay? Thus, the history of the Peloponnesian War is not strictly a story of the conflict between Athens and Sparta. The story runs deeper. It's a story of moral conflict experienced by human character, or the story of strengths and weaknesses of individuals and societies to understand forces that are usually difficult to comprehend entirely, okay, from all sides. You have to work at it really hard to understand from all the sides. And deeper also in the sense that Athenian democracy failed to comprehend the implications of its imperial ambition. So it may be for this reason that some have claimed that Thucydides said that history is philosophy teaching by example. Okay? Now, Thucydides didn't actually say that, but when you read his account, you kind of get the sense, because of this connection between morality and politics, that maybe history is philosophy teaching us by example. This wider understanding underlies in his entire effort. It will be enough for me, he says, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past, and which, human nature being what it is, will at some time or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future. The principles of his method and his vision of Hellenic history enable a deeper understanding of human affairs. And so according to him, human nature being what it is, okay, think about what that means. You need to talk about this in class. Makes such an understanding absolutely imperative. And implicitly, I might point out also, that human nature also makes understanding possible. If his main thesis deals with an inquiry into imperial ambition, and his approach to history is founded on moral convictions, how do these elements relate to each other? So one way to answer this question is to start by untangling the various strands of the conflict. So, a little bit of setting here. At the time of the Peloponnesian War, Greece was not unified. Okay? It consisted of a whole series of city-states and villages, their inhabitants speaking dialects of Greek. They all shared a common heritage in religion and poetry. These various small states shared a distinct sense that they were Greek and different from everyone else, whose essential characteristic from their point of view, from the Greek point of view, was that they were simply foreigners. So the Greeks see everyone else as being simply barbarians. That's their word. In spite of this common identity, however, Thucydides informs us that actually, there's a variety of differences among these Greek city-states. In particular, there were fundamental differences in culture, economics, and politics that separated Athens and Sparta. There's Sparta and there's Athens, okay? The inhabitants of Athens and Sparta spoke two different dialects of Greek. The Athenians were Ionians, whose customs and traditions were different from those of the Spartans, who were Dorians. And on your fly sheet, there's a little table where I have elements of the conflict, which kind of identifies these differences, sets them out in tabular form. Although such differences are often superficial, the cultural divide between the Spartans and the Athenians ran deeper. Just as Sparta was landlocked in the middle of the Peloponnesus, okay, down there in the red circle, it also isolated itself from cultural change. Okay, it was kind of relatively hard to get to. The Spartan educational system helped them field the most disciplined and effective army in the Hellenic world, and it also helped them resist the new intellectual attitudes like those of the sophists and the approaches of people like Plato and the playwright Sophocles, who's coming up, sweeping over 5th century Greece. Athens, on the other hand, was receptive to all sorts of innovation and was open to Greece's intellectual and artistic revolution, Athens being in the purple circle, okay? Open to the sea, open to communication with other places. The speeches of the debate at Sparta suggest to us that the gulf was so deep between them that the conflict was practically inevitable. The speech of the Corinthians expands on these differences. Should be on your fly sheet too. An Athenian is always an innovator, quick to form a resolution and quick at carrying it out. You Spartans, on the other hand, are good at keeping things as they are. You never originate an idea, and your action tends to stop short of its aim. So on the one hand, the Athenians are being depicted as being too quick, the Spartans too slow, too cautious. The war between Athens and Sparta was as much a conflict then, perhaps, if we kind of read in below the surface a little bit, in Thucydides, was as much a conflict of cultures as a war of politics. And I think it's worthwhile to kind of compare these maps, okay, when you can see it on a decent computer screen. To compare the kind of cultural map with the political map, and you'll see that there's a great overlap between the two. Another major difference between Athens and Sparta concerned their economic circumstances. The Spartans were in the middle of the Peloponnesus, the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and they were self-sufficient in food. The city was rich in natural resources, but very poor in money. Athens, in contrast, had too little farmland to support its population, and it relied extensively on seaborne commerce to supply its need in food and timber. So they had to use commerce to get money in order to buy food from elsewhere. Aside from its mineral wealth, Athens, and I've already mentioned the gold mines that the Athenians had in northern Greece. Aside from its mineral wealth, Athens was a thriving commercial center, so it had access to a steady income, and it was further enriched by money collected from the members of the alliance it led. It was this wealth that enabled Athens to build the Parthenon and other monumental buildings that the city is so well known for, okay, in the middle picture. It was this wealth that enabled Athens to build these buildings, okay? And we often take these buildings, these monuments, to represent Athenian democracy. But maybe we should think about them in terms of Athenian empire. Buildings like that take more than democratic ideas, they take money to build. Sparta possessed a form of government, which is very stable, that combined elements of monarchy and aristocracy. The agricultural domain of Sparta was worked by a conquered people called the Helots, who outnumbered the Spartans and were liable to rebel if Sparta showed any signs of weakness. Consequently, they had to have a strong army that could oppress these people and keep them working. To prevent this from happening, the Spartans relied on this very stable form of government and a very rigid educational system and a very powerful army. In contrast to the Spartan form of government, the Athenians, after more than a century of political upheaval, had established a democracy. And so the citizens of Athens, have to be careful here, we're just talking about a group of people that did not include women and did not include slaves, okay, but all the adult men, free men, all had equal status as citizens, and they could all participate in the affairs of Athens. In the view of Thucydides, who actually was not a proponent of radical democracy, the proper functioning of Athenian democracy depended on the quality of its leading citizens. This is where virtue and character enter the picture. So, for example, he says of Pericles, who we've already met in the context of the funeral oration, he says about Pericles, because of his position, intelligence, and his known integrity, Pericles could respect the liberty of the people and at the same time hold them in check. So in what was nominally a democracy, power was really in the hands of the first citizen. But the collective citizenry could vote, okay? So all of these free men could actually cast a vote and affect political change. And thus the city's policy could change according to the wishes of the electorate. You have to be careful about this type of thing. It sometimes produces bad results. Because an effective speaker could easily sway the assembly, or a TV show can sway the assembly, men who lacked virtue used their influence to manipulate the citizens of Athens. For Thucydides, Cleon was perhaps the most notorious of these demagogues, one who would exploit popular prejudices or passions for his own political gain, for the violence of his character, and for his influence over the citizens of Athens. It was the powerful influence of demagogues like Cleon that made the political life of democracy like Athens so precarious, so fragile. Thucydides' opposition of men like Pericles and Cleon, men of virtue versus men without virtue, gives us a hint that he maybe was arguing that goodness or virtue was the victim of the war. The various cultural, economic, and political features of these two city-states shaped their respective imperial policies. So while Sparta, think about this, while Sparta oppressed the subject population at home, the various cities or the various states within its Peloponnesian League could act with considerable independence. Okay? So they're very oppressive at home, but they have this kind of loose league, association of states that exists at the macro level. The League's political and military decisions tended to be slow because of that looseness. It's very difficult to kind of reach a consensus. And this is expressed in the opinion of the Corinthians in the debate at Sparta. Athens, in contrast, with its Delian League, was ruthless and characteristically quick to lord it over its so-called allies. Okay? So the Athenians have democracy at home, where they kind of discuss things and reach a consensus. But in terms of their foreign relations with their allies, they're very kind of strict and pushy. Okay? They get what they want. Athenian imperial ambition grew out of its powerful political position at the end of the preceding war with Persia. So remember what Herodotus called the greatest war. The growth of Athenian power, Thucydides argued, endangered Sparta's political security. Remember, the rise of Athenian empire, in effect, frightened Sparta. The gradual realization of Athenian imperial ambitions upset the balance of power between the two. The pressures built to such a degree, okay, so the pressures are kind of deep below, it's hard to see them. They build to such a degree that diplomatic maneuvering against weaker neutral states eventually triggers the armed conflict between the two powers. And in this kind of imperial world that's been created here, Thucydides points out that political neutrality, for example, in the case of a city named Melos, okay, described in another portion of your assignment, in the Melian dialogue, was very fragile. Okay? If you proclaim political neutrality, as the Melians did, you really could get into hot water. Okay? And in this case was a prelude to their destruction. In this respect, Thucydides was realistic, certainly in his depiction, but I think that realism shouldn't obscure his ideals. So, as I said, this is a complex book. It's a big book, complex book. There's a whole series of arguments, and there's a certain amount of historical data. But I think the one way to address it is to focus on the themes, okay? So as you're doing the reading, kind of think about these big ideas. Think about themes like empire, ambition, justice, noble purpose, virtue, human character, or understanding, all right? This notion of understanding things from as many sides as possible. We know that this is the story of a war between Athens and Sparta, but what was at the center of the conflict? What was lost or gained? And I've kind of hinted at this already a number of times. Thucydides mourns the general deterioration of character throughout the Greek world, what he calls the simple way of looking at things. What does he mean by this? Perhaps that political ambition can distort the way we see things, that political ambition can distort the way people act, okay? That political ambition can lead to a kind of moral collapse, right? Think about, remember, it's not history that you're reading, you're reading an inquiry into this event, this war. And one way to look at it is to kind of think about some particular examples, okay, that will allow us to kind of extract these themes. One of the dangers, I think Thucydides would agree, is that if you kind of become infected by imperial ambition, the results, the negative results, will kind of emerge very quickly. So within 3 years of the start of the conflict, 3 years of a 27-year conflict, Athens' allies start to rebel. Okay? Remember, Athens is very strict in terms of how it conducts its alliance, and its allies, or some of its allies anyway, rebel almost immediately, as a place called Mytilene did. Okay? You can visit all these places on vacation. Okay? Just go to the Greek tourism website. Mytilene rebelled. This was a matter of grave concern to the Athenians, since the Mytileneans had a very large fleet, which was a very valuable military asset for the Athenians. The issue of how to resolve the Mytilenean problem was debated by the Athenians, okay? And this is in the Mytilenean debate. Some Athenians, of course, note here that it's not the Mytileneans who are involved in the debate, it's the Athenians who are trying to sort out what to do with them. Some Athenians, led by Cleon, felt compelled to make an example of Mytilene by killing all of its male citizens and enslaving its women and children. Okay, pretty good solution, right? I should point out that, Cleon is not a bad guy because he had that idea. This was actually a common thing to do in ancient warfare. So a demagogue or man of virtue could still come up with that type of idea. Cleon argued, punish them as they deserve and make an example of them to your other allies, plainly showing that revolt will be punished by death. The central issue of the debate, of course, is not whether to spare the Mytileneans, but what is best for Athens, okay? So in the context of imperial ambition, what's best for me? Pericles had foreshadowed the moral blindness that would afflict Athens when he said, your Athenian empire is like a tyranny, okay? So an Athenian is speaking to a fellow Athenian saying, your empire is like a tyranny. It may have been wrong to take it. It is certainly dangerous to let it go. So that puts you in kind of a moral conundrum, right? You did something wrong, but you can't fix it by just letting it go, right? By reversing it. In the debate, Cleon the demagogue echoes him. If the Mytileneans were justified in revolting, then you Athenians must be wrong in holding power. So, the point here, the virtuous ruler and the demagogue sound frightfully similar, all right? The moral foundation of noble character is destroyed by the demands of empire in this imperial context. The moral collapse of Athenian politics foreshadows the moral collapse of Greek society, first observed in the civil war in Kerkyra, where fathers killed their sons, men were dragged from the temples or butchered on the very altars. Some were actually walled up in the temple of Dionysus and died there. The bonds of family are desecrated, fathers killing sons, okay? Even the basic bond of social life, language, is distorted, okay? Language ties us together, right? It allows us to communicate. It's changing. To fit in with the change of events, words too had to change their usual meanings. If words change their meanings, how can we communicate? What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. The ability, here's the clincher, the ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. Maybe that was Thucydides' problem in Amphipolis. He understood the military situation too effectively from all sides and couldn't act. Maybe. After the death of Pericles, 2.5 years after the start of the war, the state of Athens deteriorated even more, okay? Thucydides relates that Pericles' successors lacked his foresight and character, adopting methods of demagogy, which resulted in their losing control over the actual conduct of affairs. Not only did they lose control over political affairs, but they ultimately lost the basis of their empire. Private ambition and private profit led to policies which were bad for the Athenians themselves and for their allies. Okay? With the loss of character, it's too easy to adopt the principle then that might makes right, as at Melos and as at Syracuse, which is where the war actually ends. And as you can see on the quotes on the fly sheet, at the end of the war, when the tables were turned. Okay, and when the Athenians actually were on the verge of being enslaved themselves. Athens failed to understand the situation from all sides. And he near the end, he says, no Hellenic army had ever suffered such a reverse. The Athenians had come to enslave others, and now they were going away frightened at being enslaved themselves. Okay? A certain amount of irony there. So, what are we to learn from Thucydides' history? What lessons might it teach us? So that, in his words, his work would last forever. The history of the Peloponnesian War has as many lessons as it has arguments. Okay? I've already gone through all the arguments: historiographical, historical, political, moral. Clearly, Thucydides' history was built on the solid foundation of his convincing method, okay? Skepticism, accuracy, context, so on and so forth. His convictions about character, political judgments or moral judgments, okay? And shaped by his vision of history. You can penetrate history. You can go down deeper to try to understand it. So clearly all this has more to teach us than the story of the dissolution of an empire. Thucydides speaks of standards of character. While Athens and Sparta were the chief opponents in the Peloponnesian War, in many respects the protagonists of this history are Athens and Thucydides. Pericles' funeral oration praised Athens as a lesson for Greece. There's a certain irony here, okay? The irony of this praise in the larger context of Thucydides' story is revealing. Athens was a lesson for us, but not only in an admirable way. Consider what lesson Athens almost taught at Mytilene and did teach at Melos, or what her army demonstrated outside Syracuse. Don't follow the example of Athens. Okay. Human nature, being what it is, and the fragile role of the noble character in human affairs, makes the lesson of political ambition one that will be relevant forever. As for Thucydides, with his ability to understand a question from all sides and his sharp eye for pretense, which could distinguish the profound from the shallow, he penetrated the surface of his era's moral system, exposing the fragility of human goodness. Athens lost the war, and political ambition claimed a lot of victims. But really, the real victim, perhaps, was noble character, this simple way of looking at things. Time and again in the history, the inquiry, all right, he shows us that justice is honored more in speech than in action, more by the weak than by the powerful. But that doesn't necessarily make it right. By following his standards of thoughtful judgment and character, perhaps we too can sharpen our own vision of humanity and achieve something in the study and practice of virtue. Okay? So with that, I'll leave you with that message, and I'll exhort you to go and study and practice virtue. Okay? And here's what you have coming up. Have a good day. Bye-bye.